Well, today I want to talk about a practical skill with some biblical principles. How many of us would dare say that we could use a lesson or two in how to diffuse tense situations? Can you think of an experience that you've had, even within the past week, where you've walked into a situation or a tense argument? There's a popular secular book that defines these scenarios with the following descriptions. The stakes are high, meaning there's a lot on the line. Maybe opinions differ. There might not be a clear, best way to handle it. And emotions are definitely elevated. When you have a situation like that, you could call that the trifecta. If you don't know, the book I'm referring to is called Crucial Conversations, in case you've ever read it. The point being, I can bet many of us, if not all of us, have had to deal with something that fits this description. This situation presents itself often in our lives, and most of the time we can have a sense of feeling unprepared for how to respond. In my life, even throughout this past week, I can think of several situations that I've dealt with that have embodied this exact situation. Maybe a conflict with a coworker or a situation, obviously, within my own family. If you have kids, you most likely know what I'm talking about. If you don't, I'm sure there's individuals within your own family. And I think moving into this season right now where we're talking about, potentially gathering with friends and family, there's always an opportunity for this sort of thing to come up, right? And if you're like me, you don't necessarily handle that well. Usually it's heart races, and there's a little bit of that sort of overwhelm, what do I do? And typically we respond in one of two ways, right? We either respond by increasing the situation with more tension, or we tend to just bow out and completely ignore it whatsoever. In order to do that, though, and so I set this all setting here because I want us to look at a specific passage in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel, in chapter 25, that I think is a great opportunity for looking at a situation just as I'm describing. And I'm hopeful that as we read through this story in the life of David, that we'll have an opportunity to see how someone was able to take these specific circumstances and use it to the glory of God, rather than involving a very difficult and a very disastrous thing that could have happened in David's life. So if you have a Bible or a device and you want to follow along, please do so as I read through 1 Samuel, and we're going to go from verse 1 through verse 17 here. So, now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Maon. A certain man in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, he was shearing at Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. When David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them. And the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my young men. Since we have come at a festive time, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water, the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where?' David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, 'Put on your swords.' So they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. One of the servants told Nabal's wife Abigail, 'David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greeting, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields, near them nothing was missing. Night and day they were a wall around us all the time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. The first thing I want to do is introduce to us these characters and see what's going on. Let's get up to speed with what in the world has gone wrong. Most of us, I would assume, would know David. But if you don't, he was anointed by God earlier on in this book of the Bible. He's also been a giant slayer, but he's on the run right now. This is a moment in his life where he's a rogue and he's out in the mountains. He's assembled around him a band of merry men whom are outcasts, some of whom are also wanted men as David is. In fact, he has even had chances to avenge himself right before this in the previous chapter at the hand of Saul and kill him. But he rose from that situation completely different from this one. He decided not to take Saul's life, and he recognized that God was in control of his destiny, and that was not David's place to do so. But he's been wronged here somehow. Well, how? Next, we meet Abigail and Nabal, whose name literally means fool. We'll talk about Nabal's name later, but I find it interesting. I always find this interesting, too. Abigail is called out for her character traits before Nabal is. It kind of speaks to a couple of things as I think about that, potentially renowned for her for who she was. But also, it's a sharp contrast between the two and what kind of personality and what kind of person they are. We'll talk about Abigail in a minute after we finish up with Nabal, but I think it's better that we focus on who he is because that's where the story continues. It says he was a wealthy man. It calls out his massive amount of possessions that he had. It says he lived in Carmel, which is a small town outside of southern Judah, kind of below Bethlehem and Hebron, where David knew really well, and that's why he was living in the mountains there. Now, why the tension in this story? Well, to unpack that, you've got to understand a little bit of the customs of that time. In that day, it was customary to have flocks, right? Your possessions were really your wealth. And so, as these shepherds were out in the fields, one of the things that was always on their minds was to be attacked by marauders, by neighboring countries, by other nations, and to have those possessions stolen. David and his men had effectively employed themselves to Nabal for many days, working to protect his servants and his possessions. And now it was time to get paid for all that service. So, as you can tell, David's hungry. And he hears about the fact that it's time to shear the sheep. It's kind of that point in the year where everyone's talking about the good, plentiful supply that we have. So he sends a few young men to greet Nabal. And it's this way over-the-top warm greeting. If you think about it, there's a couple of points to that are really important to make. Number one, David didn't go himself. He didn't walk down there with his entire 600 men. He wasn't trying to intimidate Nabal into giving him something. He wasn't attempting some sort of, pressure on him to make, something like that his case for why he should get paid. The other thing is he sent a warm greeting, right? I mean, he's just really embellishing Nabal with all this kind of this warm, lovely talk of long life to you and blessing to you, and so it's kind of like this appeasement, right? And if you think about it in the situation that we're in now, it's kind of like tipping. And I don't know if you're like me, but I just do not enjoy that. I don't enjoy tipping. I've never had a thing for it in my life. It's kind of back and forth where you don't want to feel like a cheapskate. And given how hard it is on people in the service industry, you really want them to be incentivized to keep working right now. But that's a huge part of how people earn their living. So I'm more of it doesn't matter how bad the service was or how good the service was, you're going to get 20%. I wasn't always that way, and know that it's just me, but it's been instilled in me by others that have wisely educated me on these facts. Well, this is where it falls apart, though. Nabal's response is where he has just basically taken and thrown this all in David's face. In fact, he has no problem putting David down. He's labeling him a deserter. He's calling him a rogue. There's no sense of respect for David. There's no generosity for the work that's been done. In fact, Nabal's selfishness is directly front and center in his response. It says, why should I give my bread, my water, my meat for my shearers, right? Me. You kind of wonder from Nabal's response if he had a knack for this kind of thing. If he was just kind of that person around that just always caused trouble and stirred up a lot of strife for people in his life. In fact, you look at some of the situation and response later from his servants, and you almost get an impression that that was the case. I've had coworkers in my past where I've seen that play out, right? Where it's always someone else. If they just would have listened to me, or if there would have been I just don't get along with that person because we have differing opinions, or this person did this, and so it's been wrong to me. I think we often miss the fact that quite likely we create the conflict in our own lives. We make decisions to escalate battles and decide what we are willing to go to war over. And as we read, it only gets worse from here. We can be ignorant of it too. That's because we're not willing to take constructive criticism. And according to verse 17, it becomes clear that's who Nabal was. He had a knack for listening to no one. So now we have a dire situation. And let's see how that folds out. One man's selfish greed, has led to another's desire for vengeance. You get David all stirred up. He's now prepared to go to war. Swindoll writes that we witness David completely lose self-control. He's ready to take 400 men to crush one tightwad. We are witnessing David come completely unhinged. You can see his emotions are high, and he's willing to prepare to take that out on Nabal. I don't think I've ever witnessed as much anger in our society as we do today. I've heard it said recently that we've moved past the philosophy in our society that believes in relative truth. And that would be bad enough, right? Now we live in a society that says they care less about truth than they do about how they feel. Let that sink in for a minute. There are people who don't care if you're right as much as they care about how they feel. Does that not sound like a world living in anger? And this is personal. It is interesting to me in our current environment. It seems like we are finding less and less to talk about and more to fight about. That's a very dangerous place because there are casualties in a society like that. This desire for justice when we've been wronged can lead us to some dangerous decisions. So what should we do? This is where the story turns from bad to good. Next, get introduced to Abigail. She is said to be both beautiful and intelligent, but the word here says she is a woman of prudent insight, or to say it more practically, she is wise. She can read a situation and know the best way to handle it. She has skill in life and how to both assess a situation and consider the best way to handle it. I don't want us to lose sight of the fact, because I really think that's what I want to study here as we lay out this situation and the groundwork for this conflict resolution, and what it looks like to be able to take a situation where everything looks completely out of control and to be able to bring it back to a place where Jesus can do something amazing in the situation. I believe it applies. I think there's some principles to take away here. And I believe it applies specifically to how we address conflict that we see. So there's 2 points that I really want to make and 2 principles to take away from Abigail's response here that I want us to study. But to do that, I want to continue reading from verse 18 through 22. So follow along if you would. Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them onto donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there was David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert, so that nothing of his was missing. He paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all that belonged to him." The first principle that I want to take away from Abigail's response is she acted immediately and she took responsibility.